As Europe continue to expand military aid and funding for Ukraine, billions in fresh packages of missiles, drones, and intelligence support are flowing into Kyiv. Each new delivery of advanced systems risks being interpreted not just as support for Ukraine, but as active participation in the conflict. And under Moscow's updated rules, that raises the unsettling question of whether a nuclear response is now closer than ever.
Spain would provide Ukraine with a military aid package worth 817 million euros to reinforce its defense capabilities and toward its reconstruction.
The Russian government has recently changed its official rules on when it may use nuclear weapons. The new document, signed by President Putin, significantly lowers the conditions under which Russia would consider launching a nuclear strike. One of the most important changes states that if a country without nuclear weapons attacks Russia, but that attack is supported by a country that does have nuclear weapons, Russia will treat both countries as having attacked together. In practice, this means that if Western nations continue to supply Ukraine with advanced missiles, intelligence, satellites, or targeting information that is then used to strike deep inside Russian territory, Moscow now reserves the right to respond not only against Ukraine, but directly against the Western suppliers themselves, possibly with nuclear weapons.
If someone supplies weapons to the combat zone and calls for these weapons to be used on our territory, then why don't we have the right to act in the same way? We have the right to strike those countries' facilities from whose territory threats to Russia are created, threats to our state.
For many decades after the Cold War, the world lived under a system known as mutually assured destruction. Both the Soviet Union and the United States kept thousands of nuclear warheads pointed at each other, but everyone understood that these weapons would only be used if the very existence of the country was at stake. The threat of total annihilation kept leaders careful. Nuclear arms were considered weapons of last resort that would never actually be fired. The new Russian doctrine moves away from that old understanding. It removes the strict requirement that Russia must face an existential danger, meaning the complete destruction of the state, before nuclear weapons can be employed. Instead, the updated rules speak of a critical threat to sovereignty or territorial integrity. These words are deliberately broad. They could apply not only to an invasion of Russia's pre-2014 borders, but also to military actions against areas Russia now claims, such as Crimea or the regions it has annexed in eastern Ukraine. In short, the decision about whether the threshold has been crossed is no longer based on clear objective facts that everyone can see. It is now based on how Russian leaders choose to interpret events. Another major change concerns the kind of attacks that could justify a nuclear response. In the past, nuclear weapons were mainly linked to the detection of incoming ballistic missiles, the large rockets that can cross continents in minutes. The new doctrine greatly widens this definition. It now includes large-scale attacks by aircraft, cruise missiles, or swarms of drones. If Russian radar and air defenses believe that a massive conventional bombing campaign or drone assault is underway and cannot be stopped by ordinary means, the military is legally permitted to consider nuclear weapons as a way to halt the attack. This merges the conventional battlefield with the nuclear one. A war that begins with tanks and artillery could, under the new rules, end with mushroom clouds. The doctrine also extends Russia's nuclear protection to Belarus, its closest ally. Belarus shares a long border with 3 NATO countries, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. Russian nuclear weapons have already been stationed there. The updated doctrine declares that an attack on Belarus will be treated exactly the same as an attack on Russia itself. This pushes the line where a nuclear response becomes possible much closer to the heart of Europe. Any future incident along the Belarusian border, even a limited border clash, now carries the risk of rapid escalation to the strategic nuclear level. Taken together, these changes mark the end of the period when nuclear weapons were kept in the background as symbols that were never meant to be used. For 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, both East and West treated nuclear arms as political tools whose actual use was unthinkable. The new Russian doctrine accepts the reality of a large conventional war on Europe's edge and adjusts the legal framework so that nuclear weapons can be brought into play much earlier and under much wider circumstances. The main purpose appears to be deterrence through fear. By making the rules looser and the threats clearer, Moscow hopes to force Western governments to hesitate before sending more powerful or longer-range weapons to Ukraine. Leaders in Washington, London, Paris and Berlin must now calculate that every new missile system or intelligence package could be the one that Russia decides has crossed the new red line. The margin for error has dramatically shrunk. A successful Ukrainian strike on a Russian airbase or supply depot, made possible by Western technology, might be interpreted in Moscow as the critical threat that justifies a nuclear demonstration or worse.